وابتسما طوبى للعبد إذا اغتنما أرضى مولاه بما التزما طوبى للنفس بتقواها رمضان زمان البركات رمضان زمان الحسنات رمضان مجال الصلوات تسمو
Right here it has the dua of the day. We have a hadith from one of our imams, a prayer tracker checklist, a daily checklist that we should do in Ramadan, and then 3 or 4 names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and something that we're grateful for. So it's always good to, reflect and ponder upon what we're grateful for and what we did in our day, what we could have done better. And alhamdulillah, this journal actually, helps you navigate through that. It is $15 now. It can be found at the front desk, inshallah, or in the library. Before we begin our program, I'd like to welcome our dear brother Ibrahim Ajame with three lots of salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قد أفلح المؤمنون الذين هم في صلاتهم خاشعون والذين هم عن اللغو معرضون والذين هم للزكاة فاعلون قد أفلح المؤمنون الذين هم في صلاتهم خاشعون والذين هم عن اللغو معرضون والذين هم للزكاة فاعلون والذين هم لفروجهم حافظون إلا على أزواجهم أو ما ملكت أيمانهم فإنهم غير ملومين فمن ابتغى وراء ذلك فأولئك هم العادون والذين هم لأماناتهم وعهدهم راعون والذين هم على صلواتهم يحافظون والذين هم لأماناتهم أماناتهم وعهدهم راعون والذين هم على صلواتهم يحافظون أولئك هم الوارثون الذين يرثون الفردوس هم فيها خالدون ولقد خلقنا الإنسان من سلالة من طين ثم جعلناه نطفة في قرار مكين ثم جعلناه نطفة في قرار مكين ثم خلقنا النطفة علقة فخلقنا العلقة مضغة فخلقنا المضغة عظاما فكسونا العظام لحما ثم أنشأناه خلقا آخر فتبارك الله أحسن الخالقين ثم إنكم بعد ذلك لميتون ثم إنكم يوم القيامة تبعثون ولقد خلقنا فوقكم سبع طرائق وما كنا عن الخلق غافلين ولقد خلقنا فوقكم سبع طرائق وما كنا عن الخلق غافلين وأنزلنا من السماء ماء بقدر فأسكناه في الأرض وإن على ذهاب به لقادرون وإن على ذهاب به لقادرون فأنشأنا لكم به جنات من نخيل وأعناب لكم فيها فواكه كثيرة وأعناب لكم فيها فواكه كثيرة ومنها تأكلون صدق الله العلي العظيم صلوا على محمد وآل محمد
Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. Ahsan, Brother Ibrahim, beautiful recitation. Just another reminder, our library is open until 11:30, inshallah. Come, please check out our books, our Islamic wear selection, and much more things. Now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our dear brother and respected scholar, Sheikh Aus Asfar, with 3 loud salawat ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad.
النفس لمولاها رمضان يكفر ما فرطا من خطأ الناس وما اختلطا فعسى من عفو الله عطا لقلوب الأمة يرعاها رمضان تجلى وابتسم طوبى للعبد إذا اغتنم رمضان تجلى وابتسم طوبى
على حب سيدة نساء العالمين بأعلى أصواتكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين واللعنة الدائمة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. قال الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states in the chapter of An-Nur, chapter 24, verse 30, He says, وَقُلْ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ يَغُضُّوا أَبْصَارَهُمْ, and tell the believers that they must cast their gaze, وَيَحْفَظُوا فُرُوجَهُمْ, and that they must protect their privates, ذَلِكَ أَزْكَى لَهُمْ, that is the purest thing they could do for themselves. إِنَّ اللَّهَ خَبِيرٌ بِمَا يَصْنَعُونَ, surely Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is aware of everything that they do. صدق الله العلي العظيم. آمنا بالله. Brothers and sisters, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. When dealing with issues such as gender relations, meaning with the opposite sex, it's important for us to deal with the issue of cross-gender relationships. Specifically, we're speaking about friendships between the opposite sex. Can a man and a woman actually have a friendship? Can that friendship be one that is platonic? Or are there always exterior, or let's say, are there always other motives involved? And if so, what are the motives? And which side has which motives? And what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tell us about such relationships? Are they acceptable in Islam or are they not? Now, in order to delve into this topic, what we'll do first, as we normally do, is we'll think about things. We'll use this God-given intellect that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us, and let's see how far we can get in thinking about this and contemplating, because we know that surely contemplating for about an hour or so is equivalent to the worship of 70 years or 7 months or 70 months in one narration, or 2 narrations, I should say. That's the first thing we'll do. Then we'll look at what the science tells us. And lastly, we'll look at what the Holy Quran tells us. So let's get started. I'm sure you're all excited about this topic. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Or at least curious, right? So when we start, we always start with Tawheed, as we mentioned, because we have to lay everything upon a strong foundation. If that foundation is Allah the Unlimited, then that means that the potential of reaching the truth will become an unlimited potential. And surely whatever conclusions we come to will be sanctioned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because first and foremost, our very standards and our very moral compass will be specifically a divine one, right? One that comes from Allah and Allah alone and nobody else. Not from my own whims and my own desires. And we'll talk about that, inshallah, a little in this lecture as well as in the lecture about marriage and modesty. So I start out by saying the creator of everything or the creator of something is greater than whatever they create, and therefore the creator of all of limitation must be greater than what he creates, which means that he is unlimited, which means he doesn't have a beginning and he doesn't have an end. Why? Because those two are considered to be limits, ahsantum, and therefore he always existed and will always exist, ahsantum. That means then that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is everywhere. He sees all things without the need for eyes, and He hears all things without the need of a hearing apparatus. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala therefore knows all things. He knows how and when to create things and how to sustain them. Agreed? If you agree, say I agree. We also said that since He is unlimited, that means He has no flaws, because flaws are limits or limitations, ahsantum, brother Alex. And therefore that means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is flawless. And the sisters will tell you that if their skin is flawless, what do they say? They say it's perfect. Exactly. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is flawless, and that means that He is all perfect. There is no one more perfect than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all purposeful, which means that He does everything for a purpose. He created us for a purpose, right? We have a purpose. So that means that everything that He creates also has a purpose. So that also means that we have great worth, because Allah the All-Perfect created us. And so how important must we be if the All-Perfect deemed us worthy of existing? A little worthy or very worthy? A little valuable or very valuable? So my self-esteem should really come from my relationship with whom? With Allah. Not from any clique or any cool kids or my boss or the president of my country or anybody else. I shouldn't need trophies and medals to prove how good an individual I may be. Yes, those are important as rewards for my success, but they do not define who I am. Does that make sense? If it makes sense, say it makes sense. What defines who I am and what I am and how good of a person I am is whom? And my relationship with whom? With Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ahsantum. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So now I have to think. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us as two opposite genders so that we may complement each other. Agreed? If you agree, say I agree. Right? Yes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not make it so that we are 100% equal. You say? Not equal? Really, Shaykhna? Relax, sisters, let me explain. Okay? And we'll talk about this a little more when we come to the marriage lecture, inshallah. The responsibilities that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has deemed for men may be different than those responsibilities that Allah deemed for women, right? Therefore, since the responsibilities may be different, that means what? The roles may be different. And since the roles may be different, that means that we're not equal in that sense. But are we equal in terms of what Allah expects of us, in terms of our taqwa, in terms of our piety, which means our closeness to Him, which means our God-wariness? Yes, 100%. Agreed? If you agree, say, alhamdulillah, brothers, dodge that bullet. Okay. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So from here then I understand that the role of a woman in society is different than the role of a man in society. But they both complement each other. And without each other, society would not be whole. Would you agree with that statement? If you agree, say I agree. Good. So that means then, I have to figure out what roles has Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deemed necessary for me, and a woman has to figure out what roles Allah has deemed necessary for her, right? Do we both require, or does Allah require of us to have spiritual growth equally? Yes, of course. Does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala require us to be equal in terms of our taqwa and our struggle towards closeness to Allah? Yes. Do we have struggles and trials and tribulations as men and as women in our lives? Yes. So we're equal there, right? But now, the types of struggles. For example, I as a man could never have the struggle of losing or carrying a child and then losing that child. Does that make sense? Right? I will never be able to feel that full void or that emotion of a miscarriage or the loss of a child in the same way that a woman would. Does that make sense? That doesn't mean that as a father, I will not feel that pain. I remember when that happened to my wife and myself, it was extremely painful for us. But for her, I could tell it was much more painful because she literally lost a part of her. You see? Right? For me, I lost a part of me as well. But there's no way that I can compare the two. You see? So we can't be equal in that respect. Does that make sense? If it makes sense, say it makes sense. Things got deep real fast, didn't they? Right? Okay. So now, from here, where do I go? I say, look, I know that the divine standard of morality is how I've decided to live my life. You agree? If you agree, say I agree. Right? That is the best standard for me to take. That if I follow other GPSs, other moral compasses, right, they are limited. And therefore, I know that I'll reach a ceiling where that individual or that ism, that philosophy, that school of thought or ideology, because it is not tied with the unlimited, that I will have limited results, right? Limited successes, right? If you agree with me, say you're right. Thank you for letting me know that I'm right again. You know how much I enjoy being told that I'm right. Salawat. So from here now, what do I realize? I come to this realization that not only is my moral standard set by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that is the best standard that I can find, right? There is no other standard that I am willing to follow. Yes, I will abide by the laws of the land within which I live. That is one of the commands that Allah gives me, that I must do something called awfu bil uhud. I have to maintain my covenants and my promises and my contracts, and that's part and parcel of living with other people and living in a society that is governed by laws. Agreed? If you agree, say I agree. But I also realize that just as I am worthy and I am valuable because Allah created me and He created me for a purpose, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also created the other gender for a purpose as well and gave that gender great value as well. And therefore, I must honor that gender and I must honor everything that Allah has given it, right? Just as much as I would expect that the opposite gender honors all of the faculties that Allah has given me and my self-worth. Agreed? And my role in life. Agreed? And that if I do so, then that means that I will hold my sisters to a very high standard. A divine standard of morality. Does that make sense? Agreed, brothers? Right? Just as our sisters should hold us men to also that high standard of what? Divine morality. Agreed? If you agree, say I agree. Right? Which means then that we should only expect the best of each other, right? Which means that when I look at the opposite gender, I should look at them with a look of reverence and with dignity, right? And with utmost respect. Does that make sense? And that if I know that I might fall into thinking about the other person in a manner that is dishonorable, that I should make sure that I cast my gaze and that I control myself, right? And my desires, yes? Because we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave me these faculties, and part of reaching a level of faith that Allah wants me to reach is being able to have self-control. Agreed? If you agree, say I agree. Right? And therefore, if I catch myself or think that there may be a possibility that I may fall into thinking about the opposite gender in the wrong way, God forbid, right? That would be dishonoring them. And therefore dishonoring Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore dishonoring my relationship with my Creator. Does that make sense? If it makes sense, say it makes sense. So now, how I look at the opposite gender becomes a look of reverence and honor. You see? The silence is so that you can contemplate over this. And this is very important for us to understand. Now some brothers will tell you, but Shaykhna, but then how am I going to get married to the opposite gender? Right? Right? Well, we'll take a look at what Islam tells us. But first and foremost, we have to establish a basis from which to work, right? Okay, does that make sense? And it has to be that in order for a society to be an honorable society, to be a dignified society, to be a self-respecting society, a society that is built on divine standards, right? That it has to be that I abide by divine morality. Whatever I know is perfect and what Allah would want of me, that is how I should act towards not only myself, right, and my relationship with my Lord, but also with those around me. And that includes the opposite gender as well. Agreed? If you agree, say I agree. So now we've defined intellectually what the divine standard is going to be. Therefore, if I want to be with the opposite gender, right, and I want to build my society and create a fruitful society, one that is built on great, unlimited standards of perfection on morality, then what must I do? I must say, oh Allah, I will only look at the other gender and deal with the other gender as you would want me to deal with them, right? And I will only marry from the other gender as you deem and decree for me to marry from the other gender. Does that make sense? If it makes sense, say it makes sense, right? Now what we want to do is we want to look at the academic perspective. There are two studies actually that I found that I thought were very interesting. One was in Scientific American, and the other one was actually a study done by the University of Texas, Austin. And this study was by Blesky and Buss, I believe. So let's talk about the study in Scientific American, right? And in this study, what they did was they collected 88 participants, college students, half were male, the other half were female. And what they wanted to find out is whether men and women can actually be friends or not. And are there ulterior motives when it comes to one gender or the other when it comes to making such friendships? So they had a series of questions and they brought in couples that were quote unquote friends, and they asked them a series of questions, and they maintained anonymity because they didn't want to mess up their relationship with one another. Here's a Western society for you, right? Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And they asked them a series of questions, right? These questions had to do with everything such as, what is your motivation for having a friend from the other gender? Is it that, for example, you want protection? Is it that, you want to keep your options open when it comes to finding a life partner? Is it, and they had a whole bunch of questions. Now, what did they find as the results? They found that the men had different results than the women. How so? How women look at relationships with the opposite gender is very different than how men look at relationships with the opposite gender. This is, of course, without Islam being involved. Keep that in mind, right? We're just talking about Western society here, Western values, and so forth, okay? So what they found was that most of the men had these friendships with the opposite gender with the purpose of the possibility of having a relationship with them that went beyond friendship, okay? And the men themselves, they assessed the relationship as having great potential for them having a relationship with that person of the opposite gender. So how these men viewed their relationship with this quote-unquote friend from the other gender was that, they were really doing it because they're opening up an opportunity for themselves that could happen at one time, right? And what they found that most of these men actually had a false perception of their potential to have a relationship beyond a platonic one with the opposite gender. Okay? So most men basically saw that they were, they had it all, they were suave, they had the it factor, that whenever they wanted to switch it on, they'd be able to, explore that part of the relationship if they wanted to, right? But the sisters, or the not sisters, the women, let's say, right? These women didn't have that same view. While a number of them believed that maybe there could be a potential for a relationship, right? That's beyond one that is platonic. Most of them saw it as a means for either having someone who could give them insight into the opposite gender, right? Or that person had another friend that maybe they were interested in. Isn't that interesting, right? Or that, they didn't get along with, other women, okay? Or that they were maybe tomboyish and athletic and the women didn't get them, but the guys got them, right? So there were many reasons for the girls or the women having that relationship with the opposite gender, and most of them weren't for the purposes of finding a life partner or anything else like that, or even the potential of having a relationship with a guy. But for the guys, it was a lot more serious, right? They saw themselves as, being the one. They thought that, at least they'd be able to open up a door for themselves by being that person's friend. So this was an interesting study that was done in Scientific American with these 88 participants. That's not to say that a percentage of the women weren't interested in the other gender, right, in their friend, but quote unquote, but that the majority of them didn't necessarily look at that sort of relationship in that same way, not the same way as the men were looking at the relationship with the woman. So that's the Scientific American article. Now the University of Texas article. This scientific article actually studied male-female relationships of college students, again, because they're the only ones really willing to come in and be, guinea pigs to be experimented on, right? Because they need the $10 or the $20 to eat, right? So, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Ahmed, that's college life, right? Right? So in this study, what they found was, well, they had different hypotheses. And what I want to do is I want to share with you just a couple of the results so that you get an idea. So for example, one of the hypotheses had to do with what are the benefits of having this relationship with the opposite gender, right? One was that, and I'm going to talk about the men first, and they ranked them from 1 to 10. And then they did the same thing, so for the men and then for the women. Based on the results of the study, for the men, it was to be able to talk openly. That was number one rank. The number one thing was to talk openly with the opposite gender. Number two was to find information about the opposite gender as well. Okay, so the guys so far, they're not doing it necessarily for motives, of true friendship, but rather to use that person, right, for this sort of thing. Also, it was a self-esteem boost for them. That's the third rank thing. That, when guys, know a lot of girls, this is a great self-esteem booster for them. Number four was that, if this friend was respected by others, then they would also be respected. Number five was that they would have a dinner companion whenever they needed one. Okay, it was just interesting. Number six, that person had lifetime mate potential, that they could be a lifetime mate eventually. Number seven, that they were just giving time to help friends. Number eight was for them to gain a resource. Number nine was to increase their own social status. Number 10 was to have some sort of protection. But that was the lowest thing. Protection probably has to do with emotional protection here. Unless they're, with like, UFC fighting women. I don't know. I don't know what that's about. Okay. All right. So as for the women, the first ranked thing was to have a dinner companion. Isn't that interesting? The second ranked was that individual was respected by others, and therefore that would bring them respect. The third is protection. The third is protection. For the men, the last was protection. For the women, the third was protection. So in the case that, for example, let's say a woman is on a college campus, right? If she's walking from the library at night and she had a male friend, that male friend could walk her home and she would feel more protected, okay? All right. Also, the ability to talk openly with the opposite gender. That was the fourth ranked thing. And then to get the information about the opposite gender as well, right? Likes, dislikes, what should I do, what shouldn't I do, right? And then it's a self-esteem boost as well. The more male friends you have, the more of a self-esteem boost it's going to be for you, right? And then the next one was the lifetime mate potential. In actual fact, that ranked very low in comparison to the men. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It was ranked 7. And then gaining a resource. So you guys are a resource, right? So giving time to help friends. So again, so that you can seek help and support when you need it. And then networking. For the women, there was networking. I didn't see networking for the men, right? There was no networking for the men. Isn't that interesting? Right? Okay. So that means then the studies show that in actual fact, men and women, they have ulterior motives when it comes to having friendships with the opposite gender. And these ulterior motives aren't necessarily all good. Yes, the seeking protection, for example, is a good one when it comes to being on a university campus, or when it comes to, let's say, being outside of the university or college experience. And let's say, for example, you're stalked by someone, maybe that friend could protect you or something, because of course more women are stalked than men, right? Okay? Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And I wanted to mention this YouTube video. I mentioned the academic work, 2 important studies, but I want to mention this YouTube video because many of us have grown up in this YouTube culture, right? So there's this one a student who was in university, and he literally went to many students who were with their friends or not with their male friends. But in many of the videos, it showed him interviewing men and women, and in some cases they were sitting together. And in those interviews, he asked, can men and women really be friends? And while some girls said coyly, they said yes, right? 100% of the men said no. That really, if they were given the opportunity, and you guys all, I think, know the video I'm talking about, right? Have you all seen it? If yes, say yes. Okay, good. So a few said yes. Right? So search out that video. Can men and women be friends? Right? And you'll find it. It's a very famous one. It's got like over 2 million views, maybe even more. Right? So if you watch that video, you'll watch the body language on the women, watch the body language on the men. And you'll see that the men lean more towards, given the opportunity, that they would for sure pounce. Right? They would jump on it. On the opportunity, to be more than friends with the opposite gender. Okay? So that tells us then, sisters, and I say women, because I'm sure the sisters don't have, male friends, they're focusing on, their gender. But, of course, we live in a society where we have group study, where we go to school with the opposite gender. We're not living in a cocoon. Let's be honest with each other, right? Okay? So I went to college, right, before I was a sheikh. I wasn't born like this. Okay, I was just like you guys, right? I went to, high school and college, and I experienced what it's like, to be there. I worked in the real world, so, you have to work with the opposite gender. You're going to have colleagues, and you're going to have classmates, right, that are from the opposite gender. So there have to be certain etiquettes that I have to abide by in order for me to not only represent myself and as an individual of having high moral character, right? But also that I represent a faith, and that faith teaches me, Islam teaches me to be respectful of the opposite gender, to honor the opposite gender, right? And so when we move into the Islamic perspective, I start with this very simple way of thinking, which is most of us growing up, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, okay? Most of us growing up, our moms tell us, right, that how we should be looking at our sisters from the opposite gender is that we should think of them as our own sisters, right? If I'm right, say you're right. All of our mothers and our fathers really want us to be able to allow our sisters and the women in society to be living in a safe space, right? Where they feel like they're being honored. So for example, of course here there are no buses, but when I went to university in Montreal, right, and over there was a subway system. So in the subway system, if a woman was there, automatically you're trained to what? To get up and give them the space, whether elderly or whether young or whatever the case may be. And to always give space between you and the other gender, right? So that there's a comfort factor. There's like this space, bubble around you, as my daughter says. Get out of my bubble, right? So understand personal space. Personal space is extremely important. So we're taught all of that growing up as Muslims. Am I right? If I'm right, tell me you're right. Now, understanding that becomes really important because most of us, while we might not be aces at memorizing or retrieving verses of the Holy Quran, right? We always remember what our parents taught us about how to be with the opposite gender, right? How to be with our elders, right? How to treat our younger siblings, even though we might not implement it most of the time because, we think they're annoying, but, we already dealt with that. So remember, we're not going to treat them that way anymore, right? Okay? So now what I have to understand is, what does Islam tell me? And we started with a beautiful verse. And that verse speaks to all believers, but it specifically refers to the men first. وَقُلْ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ يَغُضُّوا what? أَبْصَارَهُم. And tell the believers that they should cast their gaze. Now, I ask you this. If we live in a society where every male casts their gaze when they're in front of the opposite gender, right? How much do you think these males would end up falling into thinking haram thoughts? Would we reduce that risk or no? How much would it be reduced? It's by the way, it's direct proportionality. Like the more I am able to cast my gaze, the more, or let's say the reverse proportionality, the less likely am I to have haram thoughts. Makes sense, right? Now what's interesting is that, sisters, like I told you, look at how Allah treats us. He picks on us first, on the guys, right? He says, وَقُلْ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ, and tell the believing men. That's the first thing. يَغُضُّوا مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِمْ, that they should cast their gaze. So the first responsibility then, okay, I hate to single you guys out. I know, us sheikhs always pick on the guys, right? We always pick on poor guys. I feel so bad for the guys, sisters, wallah, right? Right? But Allah picks on us first and He says, listen, it's your responsibility, O men, believing men, if you're truly a believing person who follows the divine moral code, then you are to cast your gaze. What, Sheikhna, if I cast my gaze and I keep walking, and there's a bunch of sisters, right? I might bump into someone or something. Okay, yeah, that's a funny excuse right there. So when we say casting your gaze, we don't mean closing your eyes when you're walking, right? That's number one. Number two, when you cast your gaze, it doesn't mean just look away the entire time until you don't see, the direction that you're walking, right? So that's not what we're saying. So don't take it to an extreme, guys. I know how you guys think. I'm a guy, right? Okay? Now, sisters, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the following verse, He actually starts also the verse by saying to the women, وَقُلْ لِلْمُؤْمِنَاتِ يَغْضُضْنَ مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِنْ. So instead of looking at the guys and saying, see, you guys have to cast your gaze first, right? Now the brothers can turn around to you and say, but Allah says, you must also cast your gaze, right? Okay? I got your backs, brothers, all right? No worries, all right? So Allah then turns the attention to the believing woman and says that you must also cast your gaze. So that means then that everybody is going to be bumping into doors and walls, right? No. Right? So the same applies to you sisters, right? So now when I'm talking, for example, and let's understand the dynamic here. Number one, the whole personal bubble and the space becomes important, right? Number two, casting my gaze becomes important. But Sheikhna, I live in a Western society, and not every woman that's there is my sister in Islam, right? And sometimes there are women who want to shake my hand, and there are women who want to hug me. So make sure you're outside of the handshake zone and you're outside of the hug zone. What do I mean by this? Okay? And there is a handshake zone and a hug zone, right? Okay? 1 arm length is a handshake zone. Got it? 2, less than that is going to be a abbuta zone, a hug zone. Okay? So make sure you're out of that handshake zone, because if you're within the handshake zone, you could get hugged, right? Brothers, I know how much you hate that. Okay? So I'm reminded by this one incident. We were going to a coffee shop, my friend and I, after we had done praying in the ICA, and at that time I wasn't a sheikh, you know, I was just a regular guy coming to pray at the Jama', right? And we went, you know, after prayer we went for a coffee, and then we were heading off to work. And in the cafe, this girl comes in, and she's not Muslimah, and he's Mallah alayhi, yani he's a handsome guy, you know, he's built and stuff like that. And he was a high school athlete, and this girl from high school sees him, and she says, "Oh my God," right? And all of a sudden, we're looking at each other as though things are happening in slow motion, right? And this girl is coming at him, right? And you could see his face in slow motion. He didn't know what to do. And I'm looking at him, and he's looking at me, and then he's looking at her. And then he's like, "Oh my God, what's about to happen?" And he takes the crane position. Has anybody seen the crane position? Right? The Karate Kid, the crane position. He literally takes the crane position. He lifts one knee up in the air and 2 hands up like this. I kid you not. I kid you not. And then he does this as though he's being attacked by an MMA fighter. Right? Right? And she automatically, right? Her arms were out like this. She's coming in for it. She's just coming in for the hug. And when she sees him do that, all of a sudden she gets this barrier, you know, of like a knee, you know, and then arms, elbows. And it must have been extremely uncomfortable for both parties, right? But watching it in slow motion was so bizarre and out of worldly, to be honest with you, right? Because his face was red as he was looking at me, and I was looking at him, and my face was red for him because I was embarrassed for him. We had just come back from the Jama' from Salah, right? Right? And you can imagine the situation, right? So what ends up happening is he does this to her, right? She comes, so her arms hit his arms. He then says to her, "Heart to heart," right? She's like, "Heart to heart, what's that?" Right? So, but he was so committed to trying to bridge the space. What he should have probably done is maybe pivoted. Like moved aside, you know, maybe picked up his coffee and gestured like that, like, "Hey, it's good to see you," sort of thing, right? So how do I deal with that, right? So establishing these zones are extremely important, but sometimes you could have extenuating circumstances, brothers, and I feel for you when that happens, because I know how irresistible our Muslim brothers tend to be. May Allah bless you. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Now what's interesting is what this woman actually said about this brother. And I'm trying very hard not to say his name. So, you know, when this incident all happens, after all is said and done, he says to me to kind of, you know, make it less awkward. He says, "Oh, I want to introduce you to so-and-so." And then after he introduces us, he says, "Yeah, we were in high school together. You know, we basically grew up together. We were in middle school and elementary as well together. So we've known each other for a long time. That's probably why she feels so comfortable." And he's trying to do what? Tabrir. He's trying to give me excuses to say why this happened, right? And I said to him, no, I understand, you know, later on. And then she says, and I told him later on, I understand. At that moment, I just looked at him with the eye of accusation, I have to admit. But then she said, you know, Wissam, oh man, I said his name, was always respectful ever since we were kids. He always treated me like I was his sister. And whenever guys would try to do something or say something, he would always protect me. He was so honorable and so respectful. Look, like this is the sort of reputation you want as a guy. Am I right, brothers? Right? So this is a beautiful thing. So now, is there then, Islamically, does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala agree or allow me to have these sorts of relationships with the opposite gender? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to respect the other gender, right? That we established. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to find a proper mate for ourselves, right? Now, of course, we know that Imam Ali salamullahi alayhi, he says, and I'll mention this in the marriage lecture as well, Jihadul mar'a husnul taba'ul, that the jihad of a woman, right, the struggle of a woman is to find a good spouse, right, a righteous spouse, right, a person who has great moral character, okay? Why? Because this is going to be the person she's going to spend her life with. This is going to be he's going to be the father of her children, right? And so it's important that this standard of morality is established so that the sisters have a good choice of suitors, right? But now, how do I get to know the opposite gender? And are friendships really, are they accepted in Islam? Friendship as a friendship, as we understand it, hey buddy, you know, what's up, that sort of thing, that's not accepted in Islam between the opposite gender. Well, what about mixed gatherings? Can we have mixed gatherings? Islamically speaking, the fatwa, the verdict is that we should avoid mixed gatherings, you know, why or when, if we think that that there's a possibility of falling into haram thoughts, right? Which means that if you're in a mixed gathering, you have to watch what kind of mixed gathering you're in, right? This is considered a mixed gathering. We have sisters on one side, we have brothers on the other side, right? There's a great deal of respect in this sort of environment. Why? Because the sisters are here to gain knowledge, the brothers are here to gain knowledge. When we're here in the mosque and we're volunteering, right? We may have sisters volunteering and brothers volunteering. Here we're seeing the moral character and the moral fortitude, right, of these individuals and how much they're willing to give to their community, to give to their religion and to the followers of their religion, right? If we're in the Saturday school or the Sunday school, right, and we have teachers who are from our wonderful brothers and teachers who are from our wonderful sisters, and they may be you know, talking about what they're going to teach their class, or maybe taking notes from each other and helping each other out. This is all admirable and very good to do, right? Why? Because the purpose is what? The purpose is helping others perfect themselves. And the purpose is what? The growth of society, right? Towards what is positive. Which means that these individuals at the end of the road, not only will they be open to seeing how the other individual thinks, right? And how much that individual is selfless and is giving back to the community, which means that that would contribute to maybe finding an LT, a lifetime partner, inshallah, who shares the same thoughts and shares the same likes and dislikes, right? Wants to be able to honor the opposite gender and wants to find someone who is like-minded. Agreed? If you agree, say I agree. And Islam agrees with that. It says it's okay. But once Islam forbids what? The verdict is that, the question is that's posed, for example, on that I recall, is that, you know, can I speak with the other gender? You know, if I'm in group study, can I, you know, be with the other gender? As long as you're not with the other gender by yourselves, because there's a narration that states that, you know, there's always a third party with, you know, the two genders if they're alone together. And that third party is shaitan. Exactly. So you have to make sure that you're in an open environment, right, where it's, you know, you're being seen and everybody sees you. Now, but Shaykhna, you might say to me, but what about the reputation of the sister if, you know, she's always hanging out with guys? And that's a very valid consideration, right? Because would I want my sister to be seen with all sorts of guys all the time? Does that make any sense? Right? What would you think of a sister that's like that, that's always hanging out with guys? Sisters, you would think what? She has a lot of guy friends, right? All right? And does that contribute positively to how you perceive her and her reputation, or negatively? Negatively, ahsantum. So the sisters said it, right? So brothers, you have to make sure that you also protect our sisters when it comes to talking to the opposite gender, and being mindful of that as well, right? Does that make sense, brothers? Okay? So then from a morality standpoint, Islam, the most important thing to it, in Islam and to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is that if you are talking to the opposite gender, right, that you limit that talk to things that are fruitful, that perhaps have to do with your work, or have to do with your, with your volunteerism, or have to do with topics that are important, say, in this world. But make sure that there's no mufakaha, because mufakaha is considered to be haram, meaning to talk to the opposite gender and to try to get them to kind of, to joke around, so you hear them laughing, and they, they're unhinged and you're unhinged, and then, so be careful, right, from that sort of communication between you and the other gender. That's not permissible, Islamically speaking, okay? But what you want to do is you want to make sure that that relationship is one that's built on respect, right, and good moral fortitude. Make sense? If it makes sense, say it makes sense. So that means then, when it comes to having group study, make sure that there's others from the other gender with you, sisters, from your own gender with you as well. So don't be alone with a brother, right? Make sure that you don't, mix a lot with guys. Brothers, the same applies to you. If every day you're with another sister and the sisters are seeing you, right, and the time comes and we want to marry you guys off, right, guess what? Your rep is not going to be great. Am I right, sisters? Right? The sisters are all like, yeah, you guys got to watch yourselves, right? Okay? I hate to pick on you guys. Us sheikhs, we love to pick on the brothers, right? Sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. I hope that, inshallah, that this idea of, or this concept of mixed relationships has become kind of clear to us when it comes to the Islamic perspective, okay? And if any of you have any questions, feel free to come and approach me after the talk, inshallah. I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows you all, inshallah, to have fruitful and wonderful relationships in which you honor each other based on Allah's system of morality, not based on, the human limited view of what morality should actually be. I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hastens the appearance of Imam al-Hujjah salamullah alayhi, that he lets fairness and equity and truth reign in this world, and that he rids us of oppression and of deviance and of misinformation, inshaAllah. I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala relieves the pressure on the people of Palestine, Ya Arhamar Rahimeen, and on all of the mu'mineen and mu'minat around the world, especially our families who are in Lebanon, who are leaving, their homes on the borders, because of the bombardment that they're going through. I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala relieves the pressure on them as well. I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala relieves the pressure on all those who are oppressed around the world from the mu'mineen and mu'minat, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala helps us to become more human in how we treat each other. I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts what little we offer in these nights, inshaAllah. He accepts your dua and your qira'ah of the Holy Quran. And I ask that you remember me and my family in your dua, for you are all be in mine. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين والفاتحة لأرواح المرحومين مسبوقة مشفوعة بالصلاة على محمد وآل محمد.